that it's the so-called wealth effect, that if your shares go up, if your bonds go up, if your house goes up, you go out and spend, and that's going to get us out of it. That's the model.
So beside the ultimate end game, which is a very, very negative consequence, I'll leave that out. Wouldn't it be better, rather than dragging it on, to let these crookeds have their way and just put their foot in the gas and get it over and done with?
Well, probably the much better model, and this is a big topic, really hard to say how you get out of this, is what Sweden did. Sweden had a big financial crisis in the 1990s. I don't know whether, probably most of you didn't know, but Sweden just about went broke. The banking system just about went broke. And that was through massively excess welfare state. And they said that really the only way that we can stop the forces that we've been talking about tonight, and Buchanan uses the term constitutionalizing controls on governments. And so you've got to control the deficit. And so in Sweden, over the cycle, and it's not too big, the government deficit must be zero, it must basically be nil. And what happened to them in the GFC, and so they had a dramatic change in debt and all the rest of it. And the GFC in Sweden was one of the least affected because they had very temporary monetary policy, which is the way you do it. They lowered interest rates sharply, and the minute it started to pick up in 2011, they started increasing them again. And Sweden basically came out of it very quickly. Now, they're being affected now by the rest of Europe pulling them down. But they had never had the crisis that we're... And they never...
The welfare programs, though?
They cut them back quite a lot. Not too severely, but much more than... much tougher.
Sweden's a very conservative nation, though, aren't they?
Well, basically... those sort of arguments of what they did has been made by economists like Buchanan for a long time. That really the way that you can't really rely on governments anymore. So you need a constitution, an economic constitution, which controls the blighters. So in Sweden, how it works is that you come out with basically a nil budget. You know, it's neither in surplus or deficit at any point in time each year, and then you work back from that. So all the programs have to fit into that. And if they can't fit in, they cut them out.
And it just keeps on going.
Well, the reason why the Swedish people accepted that was that they just about went broke in 1990s. Now, that's a really, really bad omen for the Western world, because what it suggests is that the only way that we're going to break the cycle is a catastrophic collapse in Western economies, and it could happen any day. It's what our friend Taleb calls a black swan. What will happen won't be predicted. We have no idea what. And one day, I used to say in the investment banking days, that we'll wake up and the Dow will be down 1,000 points. And it's often happened. Those black swan events. The GFC started, and most people don't know this, it started in July 2007, when overnight the Dow fell 500 points. The market wouldn't believe that, and it was being stoked by very easy Greenspan monetary policy, so it kept going up until it did collapse with Lehman Brothers and so on. But it actually started with a very sharp movement, and that'll happen one day. There'll be an almighty movement. We don't know what it is. That's a black swan. It's unpredictable, but it's disproportionate, and it's almost always negative. And when they hit, you can't get out of it, and it's very reinforcing. When I was chairman of the investment committee of the Accident Compensation Corporation of New Zealand, which is like NDIS on steroids. It's a compulsory, huge government fund, and we had a very, very diversified portfolio in 2008. when I was chairman. We had everything known to man in there. And lo and behold, when the crisis did hit, everything was correlated. Bonds, currency, private equity, everything was correlated. We couldn't get out of it, although we never actually lost, because I'm very sharp people, not me as chairman of the investment committee. We never actually had a loss we've never had a loss, not through the 2000s, but got very close. In 2009 we just about got zero, but we didn't lose money, but everything was correlated. All our fancy hedging and diversification never worked, and it won't work. The next one will be much worse, because we'll have no room in monetary and fiscal policy. It will have all gone. You see, the Fed will be technically bankrupt, because already its losses must be enormous when you consider that the Fed pushed the bond yields down and pushed the bond price up to buy $4 trillion worth of bonds, 4,000 billion of bonds. It forced the price up, and a lot of those bonds were bought closer to 1 than 3. So already the mark-to-market losses is just enormous. But what happens if 10-year treasuries go back to their historic norm, which is around 5? The Fed is going to be technically bankrupt, and lots of central banks will be bankrupt if that happens, technically. They'll just have to start printing again.
Do we all need to invest in gold?
Well, you see, it's very hard to see a hedge, because gold's very difficult to really invest in gold. You notice even when the gold price went up prior to equities taking off, and that kills gold, of course, but there was a disconnect between the physical price of gold when it got to 1900 and gold shares. The gold shares started to taper off, and then they collapsed long before the real gold. So that gold shares are not a proxy for the real bullion, and real bullion's very hard to hold unless you've got a nice big hole in the ground somewhere. And then what are you going to do with it when we're all sort of wanting to barter for onions? And
Don, there's an interesting paper from a fellow called Alan Meltzer.
Yeah, Alan Meltzer's very good. He's like James Coop.
He's about 85 years old, and he's the president of the Mannkal Society.
Yes, that's right.
And he's just done a paper that we'll put out on our web or our note, and it's the paper's called "Why Is There No Inflation?" Relatively, there's no inflation, because all the gold bugs, with all this money printing stuff, there should be huge inflation, and the price of gold should be rocketing. The gold bugs are going to get a bit upset that this is not happening. But Meltzer just explains it in very simple terms that the Fed's pumping out all this money, giving it to the Wall Street banks on condition that they don't pass it on, they don't lend it out.
Well,
and the Fed's actually paying those banks interest
to
hold the money, and all they can do with the money is strengthen their balance sheets, so there'll not be another banking crisis next time, and they can go back to paying out the bonuses.
Meltzer's a very good economist, and he's absolutely right that even though these trillions have been pumped out by the Fed, most of it is where? At the Fed. So it comes out to the Wall Street banks, basically for Zippo, zero interest, and then they sell bonds and they get cash, and then they lay their excess reserves, which are about 2.5 trillion. So a good chunk of the 4 trillion is back on deposit at the Fed, and you get 25 basis points for call money at the Fed. So you actually make money. They give you free money, and then they pay you 25 to get it back. So that's absolutely right, that the velocity of circulation of money is quite low. But that's not just due to that. There's also a very low demand for money from a lot of people who, despite Wall Street and asset booms, have very bad personal balance sheets, and they don't want to spend. They don't want to borrow, but They kind of, it forces you to borrow when...
No bank's going to loan money to them at low interest rates, are they?
Well, you see,
they're high-risk people.
It's interesting how the mortgage rate has gone up quite a lot in the US on 30-year mortgages. Of course, that's a bizarre thing, but they have 30-year mortgages there. And that's about 4.5% now. And so you might have noticed there was some very poor housing figures came out last week, which was a huge shock, and very poor consumer durable figures came out last week. So that she's a rocky road, but he's a very good economist, and I'd recommend, he's got a book called Why Capitalism, which is a good starter with him.
Following from the lady's point about precious metals, I mean, leaving them aside, from what I can see, there aren't really any safe havens, as it were. I mean, shares, property, they're out. I don't know about inflation index bonds, but then you've got cash, I mean, just basic cash. You've got bail-in over in Europe, well, actually the US and a lot of other countries, New Zealand apparently as well.
Sorry?
Bail-in, you heard of bail-in, like from Cyprus? You know about this?
Sort of a bailout.
Well, you mean the tax on deposits?
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
like, rather
Or just-
making the depositors
Just take the money.
Liable for the bank's debts. So, I mean, a lot of people think, okay, well, I can't put in precious metals because it's up and down.
But of course,
and that.
you see,
Look,
governments, as we're saying, you see, that's a non sequitur as well, because governments haven't got unlimited money. And to say the whole banking system went broke, how would the government fund that? Print money. It can't fund it.
So this is the whole point of that
Yeah,
mailing,
you know.
is that what they've done is that they've, I'm sure many of you have seen that they've just take the money, you know, the deposits.
Well,
People have the cash.
they largely took Russians' money in Cyprus. They were the only people with. Yeah, it's terrible. It's shocking, but you know, I mean, I don't know. Who knows? That probably what you'll get is maybe higher than normal long-term inflation, which might over a long period of time take care of the debt. But of course the debt is intergenerational, so us guys are giving it to the kids. And that's not a bad thing, because we're dead by the time they get it. You know what I mean? So you just sort of...
But leaving precious metals aside, what is a safe haven to get over this hump?
Well, there's no real safe haven, because, you know, cash deposit... There is not in a true cataclysmic, but I'm really hopeful that's not going to happen. But it could.
Alan better tell us about the safe havens.
Okay, well, I love gold. I'm all right with gold, but I was actually going to ask you about the unfunded liabilities in the US.
Well, that's a very good point. That the true deficit of the US is many times the stated true debt is many times the stated gross public debt. For a start, American government accounting is antediluvian. It's not even accrual accounting. Let's forget about welfare policies. Let's just talk about budgeted big projects. They only take the cash spend. They don't say that has a huge accrued liability associated with doing this, building, whatever. So it's a really it's not accrual accounting. The only country, dare I say it again, that has very close to accrual accounting is New Zealand. They basically run on it, so that ACC, the way we used to do ACC's balance sheet was we took all the unfunded liabilities into account. So when we got a tetraplegic, say a young motorcyclist, we booked a liability of 20 million. That's basically what a tetraplegic motorcyclist costs. And that's how you should cost the NDIS. The NDIS is going to be a stupendously expensive thing. That New Zealand's about the only place in the world that does that. In America, of course, they don't do any costing on the unfunded liability front. So Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, none of that's in the... And you get various estimates of what that unfunded liability. It ranges from Meltzer says about 60 trillion to Neil Ferguson says about 200 trillion. So take your pick.
Many multiples of GDP anyway.
Yeah, so the situation is much, and that is now, that's at that point in time. That's not the future liabilities, that's the unfunded liabilities already incurred. So it's kind of scary.
Don, you said that these problems are pervasive in Western economies. During the GFC, there was a widespread belief in Australia that China had saved us from the worst of the GFC, or the worst of the consequences of the GFC. But it looks, from my perspective, as an uninformed newspaper reader, that China has huge problems with public spending and public financing, and centralised decision making, centralised control of the economy, centralised control of monetary policy. Do you see these problems purely as a Western phenomenon?
Well, of course,
Are they affecting Asian?
I've used Western to include Japan because that's essentially a very Western economy. China is exactly the same. China has an incredibly bad monetary policy, massive credit expansions, huge unwritten down losses in the banking system, especially in the state-owned banks, which they're almost all state-owned banks, but some of them have private ownership. And China is exactly the same. Now, so it makes you very fearful for Australia because China's definitely slowing. The way their model works is that when you get a slowdown in the economy, or you don't hit 10% growth or whatever the central target is, you just inflate fixed capital spending. And I don't know whether you've read any of the articles on the ghost cities of China. They're hard to believe. I was on a board in the Peking University for a number of years and sort of gave me some insights into China. They just build things, sometimes with no roads to them. You know, massive skyscrapers with no roads, no people. And that's why the Chinese economy is in serious long-term trouble. I don't know when it's going to, but we've been noticing in the West for a long time that the rate of return on Chinese investment is going down, 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 and it's because it's so unproductive.
But Don, no, they were doing it to try and urbanise the farmers. So
well, of course, now they've got a solution to the ghost cities now. They're rounding the farmers up and putting them in there. No, literally they are.
Okay.
They literally are. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Forced. It's a terrible thing, but it's a sort of, that's a rationalisation, if you like, of excess investment by the state, and I don't know where China's going to end. That's another mess.
Just for the sake of the meeting tonight, instead of Paul, I'd like to be known as Peter.
I'm with you.
I've never ever been the recipient, so it'd be nice to be known as the giver.
Well, you know, it's a very good point that the Peters are getting lumbered with more, and this is the contrary to all conception of escalating CEO wealth and Wall Street bonuses and so on, that taxes around the world are actually going up now on income tax. America, UK, Australia, effectively going up. So income tax is going up. Benefits, you know, you got a lot of middle class benefits, but the Peters are paying private schools. Now this is of choice, but private schools, health insurance, on top of all their public spending through their taxes. And that tendency is common worldwide.
Going back to the Swedish solution, do you see any benefit of looking at something like that?
Not really. I mean, I do in terms of, well, you see, it's all part of a solution. Really requires looking at lots of things. It requires looking at public spending and public deficits, government deficits. It also looks, the other side of deficits is regulation. They're the same thing, basically. That rising deficits have associated with them increased regulation. They have to, because you're creating unstable situations in the economy through the deficits, and you try and stabilise them through increased regulation. That's exactly what you've had in America. It's a great thing to study current banking legislation and then compare it with the banking legislation that came out of the 30s. This stuff here is, you know, about 1,000 times more numerous, and it's a nightmare. No one can follow it.
The problem with the Swedish model, possible problem, is the Swedish Parliament presumably can vote to disengage that constitutionalisation. I mean, the Americans have a...
Governments can do anything.
...on their debt.
And they keep changing it, yeah. Governments can do anything, that's the problem, ultimately. That's why small government, you know, governments that don't have a lot of power to be preferred. We get governments with enormous power, like when I worked for Robert D. Muldoon in New Zealand, the centralised power that he had was unbelievable. You had a unicameral house with just a House of Representatives, you had an unwritten constitution, and you had the Prime Minister was also the Minister of Finance, and you had empowering regulations from the Second World War called the Economic Stabilisation Act, where we could do anything, and we did, often. And it changed my whole outlook. You know, I went in there as a reasonably left-wing university economist, and I came out quite right-wing because I saw how that power corrupts. And you know, that's another story. Yes.
Is there a role model somewhere in the world talking about the problem with left and right governments, Liberal, Labor, having to rob people to pay poor, and Abbott's hamstrung with Gonski, disability,
NDIS and so on.
All
Yeah.
that stuff. So
Yeah.
it's hamstrung.
Yeah.
You can just tinker at the margins. Is there a role model anywhere in the world where politicians are able to tell the story as it is and have people not continue robbing people to pay poor? And secondly, what about in the changing the constitution to require governments to balance their budgets?
Well, Metzler recommends that. He recommends a constitutional amendment in the US for a balanced budget.
So they have to?
They have to. But of course, that requires, I think, a supermajority in both houses, and they're not going to do it. But that's what he suggests. In places with a written constitution like Australia and America, you could do that.
And is there a role model in any country?
Well, unfortunately, going back to the Swedish case, you need a crisis. The only reason why Sweden has the type of economic management it has now, which is unlike almost anywhere else, is because they had the banking crisis in the 90s, in the early 90s, and the country just about went broke. And it gave them such a jolt that the population said, we want control of the government. And you know, and as a result, you got charter schools in Sweden. Sweden's got the biggest private school situation in the world. And that all ultimately came out of that fiscal shock in the 1990s.
This is the problem. It's the voting public are the ones that need to be brought along until they can see that this problem exists. Everyone's pandering.
And that's the gloomy thing, isn't it? That
the moral vanity of you know, you deserve this, you deserve that.
That's right.
Bonus, whatever. Everyone laps it up.
Well, you know, it's really interesting that political spin developed at the same time that the deficit economy arose in a big way around the end of the last century, the beginning of this century. And it was epitomised by Tony Blair. He started it, and he started the big spending in Britain too, you know, in recent times. And all of them do it now. So all of them talk about investment when they're talking about current expenditure. It's got nothing to do with investment, it has no return, it's just down the plug hole. And they're not going to stop that, as you suggested with Abbott. They're not going to stop that until they're forced to stop it by a crisis. So you're probably the only way that things are going to change is that you have to change, and that would be terrible. Don't know what it would look like.
I mean, that's always happened in history. Humans are catastrophe driven. So the only time where we've changed is war, famine. I've got a question. Often I've thought with the stimulus transmission mechanism, it's broken, and so when you say equities are up, only certain sectors are up. So if you're a financial sector, you're up, but most small caps, which I like to think is the real wealth, which is people probably like myself who are trying to run a small business, or if I go to market and try and get capital, it's impossible, almost impossible to get capital, yet I'm the person that...
Well, the reason why that happens is that Wall Street don't buy small caps. They're not interested in you. The market doesn't work that way.
No.
Small caps are an enormous nuisance to banks. Investment banks, most big investment banks won't touch anything under. So all they're really interested in, they're essentially index huggers, and most fund managers are. And so you're right. I mean, it's very patchy, but the index, whichever one you look at, the S&P 500 or the Dow, that goes up because that's all they're interested in.
But if you look at the percentage of people employed within those indices,
absolutely,
it's not very much.
It just makes you more gloomy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know that even though the market's telling you that we're all doing fine, we're not all doing fine, and we know that. In Australia, I mean, I used to think, what's going on here? We've got the stimulus, yet in Noosa, where I live, it's like a bomb's hit the place. You've got shops that are empty for years, you've got restaurants that have been there for 13, 15 years are closed, and you've got a property market collapse. It's kind of tapering off, but how is that possible in this great economy?
Because it's never real in the first place.
That's right.
It wasn't real.
It wasn't a real... all you got was a terms of trade effect coming through the mining and so on, and that never dissipated. And so that there was really a consumption recession in Australia, and evident anywhere you look. And even here, even Perth is not as strong as it should be. It's patchy. And so your point's absolutely right, that the sort of inflation that you've seen is limited to stuff where massive liquidity can hit it.
Do you think that then, I'm just wondering that stimulus Mark II will be when they change the transmission mechanism?
Well, I don't believe in the effectiveness of most stimulus policies, that most monetary and fiscal policies of the sort that we've had. Now, we've had this for years. We had zero interest rates in America in 2009, and we're now 2013, and we've still got zero interest rates. And, if you think this place is tanked, go there. Now, they keep telling us it's picking up. This year, most economists have forecast a big pickup in US GDP this year. It's not happening. So it might happen one day, but it's taken a long time. So you've got very low incremental growth.
You don't think putting negative interest rates at the Fed for that to stop that cyclic loop of money being passed back?
But you see, you're not basically addressing the problem. The essential reason why I think the GFC arose was excess consumption funded by excess debt. And so that American private balance sheets are horrendous, still are. That most people had massive debt of various sorts, credit card, overdraft or whatever the equivalent is in America. And it's taken a long time to pay that down. Now it is happening, but a long time to pay that down. And most people, you could give them a bucket load of cash and they wouldn't go out and spend it because they're still fixing up that very bad balance sheet. So really the GFC was a result of massive debt, particularly in the private sector, but fueled by government policy. That we all know that the mortgage crisis arose because the American government wanted house ownership to be the norm. So that they basically encouraged Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, which were government entities in a strange way, but essentially backed by the federal government. Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I got them around the wrong way, were essentially at times funding 80% of the mortgage market. They funded it in two ways: by directly buying mortgages and mortgage-backed securities from the banks, or by guaranteeing them. And so the government funded almost all of the growth in the housing market, which collapsed. And so if you want to see what inflation does, just look at the GFC, and that's really what underlies it. It was really cheap money. Greenspan cheap money. That's right. Yeah.
The GFC was then an opportunity for Australia to actually talk then about crisis and actually reacting to the situation as crisis. But at that time, politically, no party would take that risk. I mean, has there ever been a time when it has been acceptable for governments to actually react to opportunities like that, rather than waiting for the actual event?
The classic example, there are very few. There are very few examples. The classic example was Roger Douglas in New Zealand in 1985, which was a response to basically my former boss Muldoon bankrupting the country, and he lost in 1984. And the Labor government came in the latter part of 84 and started instituting the reforms that gradually came into Australia. And they did that on the back of, they said, look, we've got to do this, we're going broke. We were running...
Did make crisis politically acceptable?
It was acceptable. For about 3 years, the New Zealand public put up with anything. Eventually, the famous speech, famous in New Zealand, which is not very famous, Longy said, the Prime Minister of the Labor Party, Labor government, said we've got to stop for a cup of tea 3 years later. So he felt that politically he couldn't continue. But for 3 years, massive reforms were popular. And then they got unpopular as we started to get out of the mess. And it went back to the old ways. So that happened there, and it happened here to some extent, happened in Sweden. To some extent it happened in Britain, but Maggie's great weakness was she wasn't really a fiscal hawk. She did a lot of institutional change, like break the unions and things like that, but she didn't really cut too many programs.
The difficulty with that happening now is that they're talking about austerity in Britain, when in fact they're slowing the growth of spending.
That's right.
So
austerity now is just a slightly slower increase in the public debt.
In the 80s, where today the media, which is predominantly left, says everything is austerity, when in fact it's just not as ridiculous growth as it could be. You know, to stop it and go backwards.
Well, it just shows you how difficult it is that austerity is demonised, and there's no real example of austerity anywhere in the world. You know, I mean, one of the things I mentioned, I forgot to mention, but it's in the paper, is that a special subset of the Paulinisation process was the growth in the public service over this century. That the public service everywhere in the West has massively grown, especially in Australia under the Labor government. But in Britain, for example, in the 10 years ending 2009, the public sector employment grew at twice the rate of total employment. Grew at twice the rate. But not only did it grow at twice the rate of total employment, but public sector salaries went up much faster than private sector salaries, so that by currently now, average public sector salaries on a comparable basis are 14% higher than the private sector, and in some cases in Britain we get loadings are 25% higher. Now that's what they call the public sector premium now. It used to be a public sector discount. In the old days when I was a kid, public servants, because of job security and very favourable pensions, got lower than the private sector. Now they still have got job security for the most part and very favourable pensions, but they get a premium. That's most acute in Europe, especially in places like Greece and Spain, where public service is just licensed to steal. I'll better end on that note. Sorry, last one, because I'll be in trouble.
You're talking about the maternity scheme being a very large cost. Here in Australia, I mean, we bought your debt, our generation has, so how do you...
You never bought it, we gave it to you. It's a free gift. It's a free gift.
And how do you, so what I'm noticing...
Poison chalice.
We're not having children. We're just not having children. And how do you privatise maternity leave? Because here in Australia, it's very difficult for a woman to get maternity leave. And so as a consequence, if you're taking on a $400,000 or $500,000 mortgage, you need 2 incomes servicing that. So you choose not to have children, or you have children very late.
Yeah.
So this sort of seems to be this, it's stuck. And I know that in England...
What you do is you go and work for the feds. You'll get maternity leave there. You go and work for UWA, you get lovely maternity leave. So there's lots of it, but you get back to the poor old private sector, especially small business. They don't get anything. It's a dilemma, but I don't personally believe, and you're right, it's hard to organise a private market in maternity leave, but it's conceivable. But you see, the one reason why you don't get private solutions to public problems is that public solutions are so drilled into our head that no one thinks of private solutions anymore. You know, it's instructive that when you go back, that most things in early Australia were private. You know, the railways were private. It was amazing what was privately owned. Even benefits through friendly societies and trade unions were private. Now we think, oh, that's stupid, the government can do it. So that you don't get private solutions to too many things. And I don't think that the government's the answer to almost anything. The government, in my opinion, almost always makes things worse. And part of it is that once you introduce a scheme, an entitlement scheme like maternity leave, then it has inherent creep. And so presumably you'll have paternity leave of the same duration, and we've got to have equality.
How has it gone on in
all that sort of thing?
For example, my sister's got very good maternity leave private, but that was in England. But it just seems to be here in Australia.
Well, there's lots of wonderful things that if you want to really look into these things, but politicians don't really want the development of private markets in virtually anything, because that's their sphere. Yeah. And so...
I'm surprised that, we want it at all. I think there are some things like, for example, there's a need for security on the train where it would be ridiculous if we all took our own security protection on the train with us, because we'd be 50% security and 50% passengers. But when it comes to a choice about your lifestyle and association with maternity, that seems to be something about freedom of choice. I understand why.
If you want to read some very interesting stuff, not particularly on maternity leave, but on the whole ageing of first parents, Charles Murray's stuff on coming apart is he's got a great little story that he gave to the CIS. I'll end on this note. He said, how do you tell his theory is that US in particular, but Australia and elsewhere, is bifurcating into a super elite in white societies, not dealing with black underclass or anything like that. White society is developing into a super elite and the rest. And the characteristics of those two groups are diametrically different. And he said, how do you know you're dealing with the elite or the rest? And he said, let's assume that Johnny is starting elementary school. Firstly, Johnny won't be called Johnny by the rest. He'll be called Television or something, you know, or River, or, you know, Creek. Secondly, Johnny's